IRA years. I'll move on to the last section that we both worked in, which was called G Branch, and that was looking at international Middle Eastern terrorism. And David, when he was working there, was the head of the Libyan section, which meant he was looking not only at Libyan activity within the UK mainland, but also activity abroad and trying to coordinate a response to stuff that appeared in the media about, excuse me, about Lockerbie, things like that. During that time, I think that's when we saw the most serious things going wrong in MI5. First of all, they decided to bug a left-wing journalist who was fairly well known. She was a deputy foreign editor of a national newspaper called The Guardian. And the senior management got terribly excited about this because it was lefty, just like the good old days, you know, don't want to worry about terrorists, they're all a bit difficult, but left-wing journalists, we know what to do. So they went ahead and bugged this woman, but they didn't get a warrant. They didn't get a properly written warrant, so the whole operation was illegal. And again, David started complaining about this and saying, look, we can't do this, we're breaking the law. And also spending a huge amount of money, because this bug was kept in place for a year. It cost MI5 over £750,000 just to process the information coming off that one bug. And of course other things were going on which were of minor interest, like, you know, letting a known Libyan intelligence officer come terrorist into the UK and having to follow him around. But no, let's look at the left-wing journalist. The other thing as well that we saw, this wasn't strictly speaking in either of our sections, it was in a section called G9B, which was looking at the Iranian target. But this was a case of two innocent Palestinians who were put in prison, are still in prison. I mentioned this morning at the state terrorism talk. Basically, there was an attack against the Israeli embassy in London in July 1994. And the Israelis had been hassling for increased protection around their embassy in London for the preceding few months, because there had been a couple of other big attacks against their interests around the world. Now, MI5 had no intelligence to suggest that any Arab terrorist groups were planning an attack against the Israeli embassy. London had traditionally been a sort of safe haven for Middle Eastern groups, because they were given a certain amount of freedom of expression and things. So they didn't think they had either the capability or the intent to carry out an attack in London. So the Israelis were getting quite frustrated about this. They were also, because of this safe haven idea, getting increasingly frustrated at a political network which had been set up by a bunch of immigrant Palestinians. And it was doing very well. I mean, they were really raising awareness about their people's plight. They were raising money and funds and sending them back to the Middle East to help them. So a bomb goes off. Two innocent Palestinians were picked up. They were part of this support network. And they were subsequently convicted, not of the attack, because they had cast iron alibis, but they were convicted of conspiracy to cause this attack. And it looks like they were set up, they were fitted up, because there was a shadowy figure called Rida Maghrabi, who kept swimming in and out of their story. He was never traced, even though he was the one that bought the car that the bomb was in. He's the one who was, you know, asking them to put themselves in certain places at certain times, which led to the circumstantial case against them, which led to their convictions. But nobody bothered to try and trace him. And I think he was probably an Israeli agent. But the crucial thing that David saw was a report written by a senior MI5 officer. His code name was G91. And he had seen all the evidence and all the intelligence, more crucially, in the run-up to this attack. And his assessment, his view, was that Mossad had bombed their own embassy. Call me a conspiracy theorist, but that's what this guy said. Now, it sounds a bit crazy, but as I said, they wanted increased security. They also wanted to shatter this Palestinian support network, and they did, because these two people who were then convicted, of course, everyone else who worked with them just ran for cover. They went underground, and in fact, the network hasn't been really rejuvenated ever since. I should say as well, one was a young woman called Samar Alami, one a young man called Jawed Botme, both professionals, engineers working in London. And they were both sentenced to 20 years each for conspiring to commit a terrorist atrocity. Now, David went public about this. He said, look, MI5 have a serious considered view that these guys were not responsible in any way for this attack. Now, you think a whistleblower comes forward and actually says this. So immediately, any sense of justice, these two people would have their convictions quashed, and perhaps, you know, if there's evidence implying that they knew evidence, that there'd be a retrial at the very least, but they should be released and and the case looked at again. Not in the UK. That would have been vindication for David Shayler, and the government couldn't afford that. So in order to make sure that a whistleblower didn't get any credit in the national media, they played fast and loose with these two people's lives. They have never been released. They haven't had a retrial. They are still rotting in prison. They've been in their cells now for over 10 years. They've got another 9 years to go, just because the government won't give Shayler any satisfaction. I mean, I just think that is absolutely psychopathic. The final thing I want to talk about